Welcome to the show. My guest is Dan Carianis, the Director of Public Sector for RSA. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Jason, thanks for having me.
Let me set some context for our discussion. The term risk management has taken a whole new focus over the last few years. It started with cyber risk. Now agencies are forced to address enterprise risk, supply chain risk, and now maybe a new phase is emerging, something that's being called digital risk management. Let me back up for a second and give you a little bit of idea about enterprise risk management. In 2016, GSA issued a framework around enterprise risk management to help agency executives understand how to better manage all types of risks. This is a playbook, details 10 different risk type, reputational risks, operational risks, and of course, cyber information risks. The playbook states enterprise risk management can help to focus and inform decisions by defining goals and objectives, advocating for and aligning resources, monitoring progress, and ensuring compliance with applicable laws, regulations, controls. But as this idea of digital risk emerges, it's almost combining several of those individual threats into one bigger category. Gartner, the market research firm, says failure to manage an agency or an organization's digital risks is likely to sabotage your digital business and expose your organization to potential impacts, well beyond the simple idea of opportunity loss. The extent to which CIOs engage in digital risk management can be a crucial factor for avoiding such dangers. But it's not just the CIO's responsibility. The agency secretary, deputy secretary, as well as others in the CXO community must grasp that these risks are and how to mitigate their impact. In fact, Gartner found in a 2017 CEO survey that 65% of the CEOs they surveyed think their organization is falling behind in risk management investment and discipline maturity. And 77% are concerned about how risks associated with digital business initiatives. So, how are we going to deal with all these new risks, the emerging idea of digital risk management? Well, again, that's where Dan Carianis comes in. He's the Director of Public Sector for RSA. Dan, first start by defining digital risk management. What is it?
Well, Jason, you kind of hit it on the head a little bit already. It's a very, very broad topic. If you think about it from a conventional risk management perspective, many folks think of it more, particularly in the industry that we live in here in the federal market space around IT security or cyber risk. But there's so many more factors now that decision makers and government agencies need to think about. Reputational risk, financial risk, data and information management risk, supply chain risk, business resiliency and the risks associated with that. So there's so many other factors now that have caused this to become a much bigger, broader topic that agency decision makers need to contend with. So digital risk management is really the concept of understanding all of those risks and being able to, at a leadership level, being able to think through business process decisions, what I need to act on because of the prioritization of those items. And it could be far-ranging and wide within an agency.
It's interesting that you bring up this idea of this broader perspective of risk. Do you think that this is just part of the maturity that's been happening over the last, we'll call it a decade, about understanding what risk is? Because previously, the previous 25 years, what did we talk about risk? Internal control risk, right? It was all financial management related.
Yeah, I do. I think it's just a natural progression to the way people think about risk going forward. I want to talk a little bit when we have an opportunity to talk about financial risk as well and the cost associated with that and how people need to consider that. But if you kind of think about, the market space of governance, risk, and compliance, something that's been defined by the major analysts for years, we see an evolution, just as you described, where Gartner thinks of this as an ever-evolving market space, and digital risk management versus just governance, risk, and compliance is really where people are going now and where leaders need to start thinking about risk in a very deep, broad way.
Do you get a sense it's starting to happen? Do you get a sense that agencies, federal, or even the state and local government, that the public sector is understanding the challenges they face from that broader perspective of digital risk management?
I do. In some cases, if you think about the whole DHS CDM program, it's all about continuous monitoring, understanding what's going on across your enterprise, being able to act on something based on prioritization. But it's really a gigantic risk management program is really what it's doing. It's defining risk. It's helping individual leaders within agencies and at the top levels of the government make good risk-based decisions. A lot of state governments are looking at this now. So we at RSA have perspectives around what other state organizations are looking to do, and they're looking at the federal government and what's happening here to a degree, I see the federal government leading the way in terms of how people are looking at risk. It's different, but it is a very evolving space right now.
You bring up CDM. I could talk about CDM all day. I think maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about the trends you're seeing when it comes to security. The risk management piece is important, but what are some of the other trends that you are starting to pop up around, whether it's related to this idea of digital risk management or more broadly?
One example might be supply chain, if I could talk about that for a moment. As the federal marketplace continues to evolve and push applications out to providers, those could be cloud providers, those could be software as a service entities, those third-party entities that are managing information for agencies. Risk now and therefore supply chain is a very, very important consideration that many leaders within the federal agencies need to start thinking about. Same thing is true, by the way, in state and local. In many cases, they might not have the means, the financial capital, they might not have the personnel that can deal with supply or the applications in-house. And so consequently, they're pushing stuff out to suppliers as well. So the extension now becomes, from a risk model perspective, much broader than what we have thought about in the past of a bunch of folks in the basement managing my IT assets, that type of thing.
Let's go down the path of supply chain risk management a little bit. We've seen a ton of action on Capitol Hill. There's provisions in the Commerce Justice State Appropriations Bill that came out of the House. The National Defense Authorization Bill for 2019 has provisions about supply chain risk management. Huawei, ZTE are in the news. There's potential executive orders coming from the White House around supply chain. This idea of risk and understanding what's in your supply chain, what do you think spurred that? Do you think it's just, again, we'll go back to my word earlier, evolution, or did something else spur this really focus on the supply chain?
A couple things. From a information risk management, I think some of the unfortunate events that have occurred here in the federal marketplace, breaches that have occurred, both known and unknown, I think have spawned some of this consideration around how the supply chain needs to be taken into account here. The good news is there are terrific suppliers out there who are providing great value to the government. But at the end of the day, a government decision maker, a government leader needs to understand those suppliers, what resources, information, content I've allowed them to have access to because they're managing it for me, and are they taking good care? The proper controls are in place to manage those environments based on the way we within the federal government define security practices being conducted. So supply chain's huge right now. I made a comment earlier about I think that there are events that are probably a known and unknown. I mean, just imagine for a moment a parts manufacturer. I've got components on a board. That board's in a computer. That computer is, that's a server. It's sitting in the basement of an agency, and there's a vulnerability associated with some part. That's like 3, 4, 5 levels down on the supply chain. So there's a lot of thinking that people need to go about to make sure that they've got themselves covered.
And especially as we talk about the Internet of Things, which is one of those terms I just hate, but as we talk more about it, how everything's connected, your refrigerator, your car, your toaster, the old joke that everything has an IP now, that supply chain becomes even more important because as we saw, you talk about breaches, the OPM breach from 2015, what did they do? They got onto a contractor's website and then they hopped to the federal network and was able to take the data. That hopping, the network hopping, is really why I think there's another piece to this discussion about supply chain.
Absolutely. Another concept around digital risk management could have to do with physical security and physical risk. You might have a pacemaker. I hack your pacemaker. You happen to be the president of, an organization, or, God forbid, within the United States, a senior official. So there's a lot of things to worry about and think about now. And those are just some of the things that I think are just now evolving around digital risk management that need to be considered. And people are already putting in place good practices, controls, et cetera, to manage those in a very, very thoughtful way.
As you talk with your federal customers or your other public sector customers, how often does supply chain risk management come up? Are you seeing it more in procurements and RFIs and RFPs? Are you seeing it more in discussions?
Oh, it absolutely comes up all the time in procurement activities. It also comes up, though, if you think about it, where most of these larger federal RFPs that get released, you have multiple vendors. You have a prime, you have multiple subs, you have subs of subs. So there's a lot of thought process that on the contractor side, and therefore consequently the procurement side of the federal marketplace, they need to think about and put in place provisions and controls in place to manage that risk.
There's an interesting court case that I won't go into too much detail on, or with Social Security Administration and buying printers, and they put in supply chain as an evaluation factor. Is that where you guys see it very similar, where most of the supply chain risk is being talked about as an evaluation factor, or more on the compliance side, saying you must abide by NIST 853 security controls, XYZ?
Well, the latter part, Jason, what you said about the NIST security controls, for sure that. But we're seeing now where organizations are being evaluated, and there are companies that are providing services associated with the risk associated with a particular vendor. So if I'm looking to potentially have you be a part of my team, I can actually go to third-party services and get a unbiased review of you and the potential risk that you might pose. That risk could be a financial risk because maybe you've had some difficult times recently. That risk could be maybe you were breached not too long ago. So there are services now that are providing this, and that's how some larger organizations are evaluating their suppliers.
I think that's an emerging market.
Absolutely.
If I only had gotten in a little sooner, the whole supply chain piece.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I wanted to bring up is you talked about some trends that were going on, and supply chain's one big one. Is there a second trend, a third trend that maybe you'd point to?
Yeah, another one I'd kind of point to is this concept of continuous monitoring. Again, I mentioned the DHS CDM program earlier. One of the things we're seeing is CDM has kind of really brought awareness to the fact that you just can't perform an assessment, in a infrequent with an infrequent period of time lapsing between the two. You really need to be doing this on an ongoing basis. The federal government's kind of driving that right now as it relates to CDM. We're seeing a lot of state governments that are now adopting this as a best practice, where with more frequency, they are continually monitoring their system, performing an initial assessment, and then continually monitoring to that assessment that they performed in the past to make sure they're improving, the risk factors are going down, those types of things. So we're seeing a lot more of that. Another topic, another area has been in the area of business resiliency. I think there's an inevitability that most large government organizations, commercial enterprises as well, they are accepting the reality that they're getting attacked. I think just in 2017, there was a research study done just from a ransomware perspective that the government marketplace is the number one attack space of all market segments. So the inevitability of someone coming after you and potentially the inevitability of someone breaching. So what's your business resiliency plan? So we're seeing more people put really good effort into what used to be 3-ring binders on the shelf, and now people are very conscious of that.
And when you talk about business resiliency, can you talk a little bit more about how to define that? A lot of people think of COOP, right? Disaster recovery and COOP. Mm-hmm. And that is part of business resiliency, but I think you're talking maybe broader or from a different angle.
Well, we kind of think about it from an RSA perspective in kind of 3 buckets. Continuous monitoring, building my continuous monitoring, my COOP plans. Crisis management. What's the crisis? If I have a crisis immediately right now, how do I deal with that? And then the recovery from a disaster. So we kind of think about that from a 3-legged stool perspective. All 3 of those are very, very important in a business resiliency program. Just doing one of those well is nice, but the reality is all of those have a dependency on one another, and consequently, all of those need to be taken into account.
All right, Dan, that's a good time to take a quick break. When we come back, we can jump into CDM and a little bit more about business resiliency. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.